Hello, everyone. This is Madlit Musings with Jaime Jo Wright. And today I'm super excited. I have Stephen James with me. Hey, Stephen.
Hey, how are you?
Good, good. It's so good to have you here. For those who aren't familiar with you, which would be a travesty, but if they're not familiar with you, you are a national best-selling novelist. I'm reading your bio, by the way, because I'm that cool and professional that I read these things.
That's amazing.
But you're award-winning, pulse-pounding thrillers, critical acclaim, growing fan base. Tell us just a little bit about your books, and you've got one that just released here this April,
Yeah.
called Broker of Trust.
Yeah, Broker of Lies. And so
Oh, Broker
uh
of Lies.
and no, that's fine. It's all good. So but I started writing nonfiction back in about 2001 and then moved toward writing novels in about maybe 2006 or so.
Okay.
So since then I've mainly been writing thrillers, suspense novels, and but before that I wrote books on how to tell stories, on inspirational books. And it's interesting, like I've written books on how to tell Bible stories to preschool children, and I write serial killer novels. So it's
I love
like
it.
my wife says it's like inviting Stephen King over to do a puppet show for your kindergarten class. So I mean, but that's just like all different types of stories, obviously for different groups,
Right.
But you're a Sunday school teacher. I'm not going to give you my novel as an example of like what type of story to tell, but so my novels are pretty gritty. They're a suspenseful thrillers. Um, and as we were chatting about it earlier, I like to ask big questions in the stories if I can, like questions about good and evil, and what are we capable of, and does justice exist, and if it does, what does it look like, in the world, or what does it mean to forgive or be forgiven when someone's done the unforgivable?
Mm,
Just different,
yeah.
super interesting questions that I don't really know the answers to. Like one of the books that I wrote, so I don't start with a theme, I start with a dilemma.
Okay.
And so, yeah, so like I don't start with a theme of like love, forgiveness, or something like that. I always think of a question or dilemma, like one of them was, what's more important, protecting the innocent or telling the truth?
Oof.
So if you had to choose, like if you tell the truth, innocent people die, but or you could lie and protect their lives, what would you do? So like to me, I mean, I'm not trying to tell you what to do. I just want you to think about what's more important, truth or justice.
Hmm.
And so a lot of my friends might start with the idea of I'm going to write a theme of truth or whatever. And so that's fine, but I always think that it's more interesting to write about dilemmas and questions. And
Yeah.
so yeah, so with Broker of Lies, I was really asking this question of, is there a difference between justice and vengeance, and basically where's the line?
Mm,
And it's kind of interesting, like if society doesn't see justice meted out to someone,
right.
since we should be pursuing justice, is it our job to do that individually? Like,
Mm,
let's say justice is not meted out to someone, but then it's against the law for me to mete the justice out against
right.
them. How does that work? And like, if, should we take revenge? Like, God is, the Bible says stuff about like, is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord, or whatever. Well, if we're supposed to be imitators of God, where should we draw the line between
Right.
justice and vengeance? And so anyway, so to me, lots of interesting kind of questions
Right.
revolve around that. And so yeah, so the new book explores that. I've had books that have dealt with truth and the darkness, like kind of drawing us in, like where
Hmm.
do I what would it take for me to kind of step over the line and do something unthinkable? And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, and usually when I start, I don't know the answer to the question I'm asking, because if I knew the answer, it wouldn't be a dilemma. It would just be like,
Right.
all right, it's me just telling you what you should believe. So, so every book to me is a journey, a deeper journey philosophically into
Mm,
some of these things that matter most:
yeah.
meaning, truth, justice, life, and all of the questions that would revolve around those.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I love talking about the deeper things like that and those conundrums. And the theme of justice and vengeance is one
Mm.
of those where it at first glance I look at it and I'm like, this is really black and white. And then you start thinking about it and it gets grayer and grayer as you move to the middle. So tell us a little bit about your journey in discovering that.
Yeah, I mean, justice is so fascinating to me. Like when you look at the world, um, the natural world, let's say,
Hmm.
you don't see any evidence of justice. Like there's no justice in the jungle. I mean, there's
No, there's
just
not.
there is life and there is
Right.
death. And yet, we as human beings, any culture that's studied in any era of history, we all want justice.
Hmm.
And so, even though there's no evidence for justice in the world, in fact, there's a lot of evidence that justice does not exist in the natural world. It doesn't seem to anywhere where we look. And yet, we all think that it should in
Yeah.
this life. And so, like, I remember talking with one person one time about it, and I was like, "Do you believe justice exists?" And he said, "Yes." And then I was like, "Well, then you believe God exists too?" And he's like, "No, I don't believe God." I was like, "Okay, well, I don't understand because like to believe that justice exists, you have to believe in an afterlife. Because
Right.
in this world, it doesn't always. Like innocent people get sent to prison. I just saw a story today about, someone who got out after 28 years in prison. It's horrible.
Wow.
And innocent, and innocent and guilty people get away with things,
Right.
sometimes. So without an afterlife where there's a reckoning, then there would be no justice in the world. So if you believe in justice, that it exists, you must believe that there's an afterlife. And if you believe there's an afterlife, you have to believe there's a God. So it's really fascinating for me just to even think about the concept of justice
Right.
and whether it exists and why we would expect that it should. Like we
Yeah.
all think things should be fair, like life should have, be fair or whatever. And so it's so ingrained in us. And, I actually think that's because people are made in the image of God. Like I actually
Hmm.
believe
Right.
that that God is a God of justice and that we naturally think and pursue that because of who we are. Now, people can agree or disagree, but I just find it fascinating to think about.
Right.
And so in this book, Broker of Lies, my main character, um, basically kind of wants revenge on a person that he believes has killed his wife.
Mm.
And so, as this, I guess, or justice, but he doesn't seem to really differentiate between. He wants the person to be punished
Suffer. Right.
and to suffer, right? Yeah, for what the person that he believes killed his wife. And so, because of that, he asks a lot of questions regarding if no one else is carrying out justice, shouldn't I do it? Like, why should it only be in the hands of a group of people called society and not the individuals who make up the society?
Right.
But the story is, I mean, obviously it asks philosophical questions, but it's a thriller. I mean, it's just kind of an espionage thriller. So all of these questions occur within the realm and the fabric of a suspense, a
Sure.
suspense novel. Right, right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so I just think that no matter what story it is you're telling, whether it's a movie or novel or personal story, whatever, I just kind of feel like the greatest stories, the ones that are elevated, ask big questions.
Hmm.
And so by letting him ask some of these questions, hopefully that it's not just about a terrorist attack and stopping that, but it's actually a deeper book that will kind of get people thinking about questions that
Yeah.
matter.
Yeah. Definitely. I was thinking as you were chatting about the concept of justice and that being evidence for a higher being or evidence for God. I was thinking how juxtaposed God sometimes seems when you look at scripture.
Mm.
And he's a very just God in a lot of ways. And then there's this other side to him that gives grace when justice is really is deserved. So, how do we reconcile that? Did you
Yeah.
discover that
I
answer?
mean, like, I feel like there's a difference, between justice and mercy.
Hmm.
Um, So mercy would be giving someone compassion they don't deserve, and justice would be giving meting out the punishment that they do deserve. Um, but when I started, reading about justice and injustice when I was working on this book, I thought I knew what justice was, but then I was reading some books and I was like, I think I didn't really understand. Justice is almost always I don't know how to say, like, when I say taking advantage of, I don't mean in any like physical or sexual
Right.
sense, but like
Yep.
taking advantage of those with less power.
Mm.
And like in throughout the Bible, which you mentioned, like there are lots of places where it says like um God does not like it when the powerful oppress the poor and things like that. And so I'd never really thought of justice as being the immoral use of power, of injustice being the immoral use of power or oppression. But I've started to kind of think that it is like it's
Mm.
oppressing those who are weaker or in some cases less privileged, or I don't know whatever term you want to use, but it's the oppression of the strong over other people, those in power, let's just say.
Right.
It's oppression, and justice is very closely tied to oppressing other people. And so yeah, it's just super interesting journey, like that I hadn't really anticipated to think about
Yeah.
all of those things. That and the more you actually start to actually kind of dive into the Bible, like you mentioned, when you ask these questions, there it's all over the place. Like God loves justice and he hates it when people take advantage of the poor. And you know, so it appears so often that but I've never heard a sermon on it. Like,
No,
like,
it's true. I
it's
was
just
trying to
not
think of that.
something
Yeah.
it's like it's there, but people don't really talk about it that much. And I don't know why it's exactly, but I do feel like mercy and compassion are super important, obviously as well. And so, um, and just we love to say we want things to be fair.
Right.
We love to say we want justice to be done, but we really don't, because like, would you really want to get a fine for every time you ever broke the law speeding in your life? Like
Oh,
that
I've
would be
never broke. No, I've never broke that law
yeah, like
ever.
that would be just if if suddenly someone came is like, I really want life to be fair. Okay. And we were able to look back over your life and fine you for every time you
Oof.
broke the speed limit. That would
Right.
be fair
Yeah,
because
it
you're not
would.
supposed to break the speed limit.
Correct.
But we don't want that.
No, we
We really
don't.
don't want we want it to be fair as long as it benefits us.
Right.
Fair in that
Yeah.
term. But um so yeah, so it's lots of cool questions stories always to me are built around unmet desire, tension, let's say.
Hmm.
So if I start a story knowing all the answers, then I've taken the tension away. And all I'm trying to do is beat people in the head with whatever answer I came up with.
Hmm.
But instead to actually say, huh, maybe I never thought about it that way. Well, what does it mean? And is there a line? And does the line between justice and vengeance move? What moves it? Is it different for different cultures? Should it be or should it not be? Um, yeah, interesting stuff to think about.
Oh, it is so interesting too, because I was even thinking about justice from the standpoint of you mentioned vengeance. I'm like, what is pure? What determines pure justice? So
Mm,
justice with the intentions of giving what is deserved versus, I don't know, I'm coining my own terms here, but
mm.
impure justice, where, yeah, I want justice for this. It is deserved for this, but I also maybe have a personal revenge or personal vendetta included. And where's the line between those, or is there one?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my main character really does have to make a decision about what his view will be at the end when he has a gun and he's
Hmm.
aiming it at the person that he believes has killed his wife. And so he has to face that choice of what to do. And what role he should be playing in this instance. Um, So it was not really an easy scene to come up with and to figure out how everything resolves.
Right.
But yeah, so it was fascinating. And for me, that's why I always write organically. You probably know that, like that I don't outline or plot anything out,
Right.
follow templates and formulas like that. So I'm for me, writing is is a journey of discovery. As I'm writing, I'm like, I don't know what's going to happen, and then
Mm,
oh, that was surprising. Cool. Well, that's
yeah.
interesting. So yeah, so that happened with this book for sure.
That's awesome. It sounds like a thrilling book. I love the deeper questions that you're putting in the books too, because I think that makes a story richer when you
Mm.
come out of it and you're still chewing on the story long after the book is closed, because it's brought up questions that you have to consider.
Yeah, I hope so. There's nothing wrong with reading books that simply entertain. I get that. And I love Of course, I want to be entertained. So I want my
Right.
books to do that, at the very least, entertain. So they're super thrilling as much as I can make them. I think what you just mentioned though is great. Like if you can tell a story that super entertains people and then at the end leaves them thinking and maybe growing or processing things in a way they hadn't thought of before. I think that really out is it's amazing. Like if you
Yeah.
can do that, do it both. Too many times like a book comes out and you read it and you're like, oh, he's just beating me over the head with what he wants me to think or feel or
Hmm.
something. That's not as helpful. And there are some where you're like, okay, well, that was really interesting. It was like spectacle and it's gone and it doesn't really do anything. But if you can have story and like um well, like a deeper thought, like we were talking about, um, then then that really elevates it. Um, I've been thinking over the last couple of years, my view of story has changed actually. Like
Okay.
I thought I knew what a story was for many years. And I taught story. I wrote 2 books on writing.
Right.
I have a master's degree in storytelling. So I was like, I think I know what a story is. But I've actually changed my view of what I think a story is. And so I feel like all stories have 4 elements, but all great stories have 2 additional elements.
Mm.
So basically, I'll just go through it really, really
Yeah. Do
quick.
it. Do.
But basically, and you'll be like, Steve, literally, this took you 30 years to come up with that a story needs a character. Yes, a story needs a character. So yeah, I know that one seems pretty obvious. And then there needs to be a setting and time and place. So that seems obvious as well. A lot of people would say that a story needs plot, but I don't think that is really the next aspect. So you need a character and a setting, but also you need a struggle.
Hmm.
So if there's nothing to overcome, there's nowhere for the story to go. So something has to go wrong. And then there's pursuit. That's the fourth thing. So
Mm.
pursuit is where the character has a deep desire to obtain, avoid, overcome, avenge, withstand something, whatever that might be. And they make choices dictated by that desire. So those 4 things, you can't have a story without the 4.
Right.
You can't really have a story without a struggle or without a setting or without a character or even without pursuit. Because if you take pursuit away, you just have bad stuff happening to someone and it's just like, and then they die.
Right.
Like, wow, that
Right.
was
Right. Right. Great
depressing.
book. Yeah.
Yeah. So those 4 you can have a story, and a lot of stories just have those 4, but they're not as powerful. But to really elevate your story, so you need the next 2, which is a pivot, which is what I call a pivot. So pivot is a moment in which something unexpected and inevitable occurs. So it has to be both
Okay.
aspects. So, for instance, if your story was like a detective story, let's say, and your readers are reading it and they're like, oh, I think I know who did this. Like, I know who did it. He did it in the library. He killed him in the library with the candlestick or whatever. And then that's exactly where it goes. It's going to be too predictable. Readers are going to be
Right.
like mad. They're like, no, I completely figured that out like 200 pages ago. So it's too predictable. So in that case, it's inevitable, but it's not unexpected. On
Correct.
the other hand, if it's simply unexpected, like you're writing your Amish romance and suddenly these aliens land, shoot the cows with photon rays and take off into space, you're like, well, that was unexpected, but it's probably not inevitable. So it has to have both. Otherwise, it's too outlandish or too predictable. And I just don't feel like people are really taught to write from a pivot or to write toward a pivot, that
Okay.
they should.
Hmm.
And so that's why a lot of stories you read, it's like suddenly something just happens to solve everything at the end. It's too unbelievable, or it's just too predictable. It's boring. So you need that pivot, and then payoff is the last, and that is where the story really does ask some deeper questions, or maybe if it's a romance story, it makes you cry, or it's a
Hmm.
humorous story, you laugh, or it's a horror story and you're scared, but it has payoff in the end. And so it's deeper than just the events occurring. There's deeper meaning within it.
Yeah.
And so as I write, I'm really trying to keep those 6 aspects in mind in every scene
Mhm.
and in the story as a whole. So like if a scene doesn't have a pivot, I feel like it still needs work.
Okay.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
it's going to be too predictable.
Right.
Like, oh, I know exactly what's going to happen, or it's going to be too like unbelievable. So
Hmm.
without the pivot, and so it's been super interesting over the last few years to sort of teach people to really rethink what a story is. And when people just say like a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, that's super not helpful because of everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Like a
No
bratwurst has a
kidding.
beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, so it's like not super helpful. But it also it makes people think that stories are about the progression of events instead of a collision of desire. And
Mm.
so stories are not just about things occurring. That's a report. I woke up this morning, I had coffee, I came downstairs, I did this podcast, whatever. That's not a story. And so to really get people to move back from that whole aspect and say, okay, like what really is a story? Well, it relies on tension, it
Hmm.
relies on unmet desire, it relies on pursuit, relies on these moments that pivot the story forward. And all of a sudden, you can start writing faster, better, with less revisions because you're actually getting to the core and the heart of what a story is all about.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I'm going to go back and replay this whole podcast and take a whole lot of notes there. But it's so true though, and then when you are addressing those deeper themes in your book too, those themes start interweaving between those pivoting moments and those opportunities to boost that story forward and also boost the question forward in the mind of the reader, um, as to what they're struggling with and wrestling with in that story.
Yeah, wrestling is a good, struggle is a good word. Wrestling is a good word. It's like so often stories when the people come to a story with this whole idea of like, oh, we need a first act and a second act and a third act. Well, stories might have 3, they might have, way more than 3
Right.
acts. And so the whole idea of thinking just simply about the temporal aspect of story without diving into the actual elemental forces within a story, I think is not as helpful.
Yeah, I would totally
Yeah.
agree with that. All right. So Broker of Lies comes out in April, and that's coming out from Tyndale Publishing.
Yeah.
But you have a whole backlist, so there's no shortage of Stephen James books if people want to read them.
Yeah, I've written a few over the years. So there's, I think, 18 novels and almost 40 other books I've done over the last 30 years. But for the most part, the last 15 years have been writing thrillers and
Mhm.
suspense novels. So
Yeah,
people could always, look for them anywhere where they look for books, or stephenjames.net has links to all the publishers and
perfect.
buyers and stuff like that.
Great. So yeah, if you're an aspiring writer too, there's some books that you've written to help with that, and
Yeah.
that's awesome. So I really appreciate you being here today. This is great. I'm going to go start looking up the word justice and vengeance in the Bible now because I'm starting to think,
Oh,
I have all these thoughts going through my head now going, but God is so often talked about as being unjust. And the world looks at him as unjust. So how can he be just and unjust? Yeah, my brain's just kind of swirling now.
no, that's good. And I mean, the question is, if there's evil in our world, is God just, or is he evil, or is he impotent to be able to not address those issues? Is he
Right.
not all good, or is he not all powerful? And I love to talk about those questions with people, and I think they're legitimate, questions discussions to have. And so it's, for me, it's just like, our lives are short, and so big questions matter,
They
literally.
do.
It's good to talk about them.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be afraid.
No.
To
Well, and I think
address them,
sometimes, yeah, people
so
are afraid to talk about them for fear they're going to come up with a wrong answer, but you
yeah, I
can't come
know,
up with
right?
any answer if you don't talk about them. So,
Yeah, so it's great to think about, and I feel
yeah.
like I really appreciate your time to be here, but also just to talk about some of these important, fun issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast, and blessings to you as your book releases and you continue on. So, and you have a podcast too. We should throw in that you have a
I do,
podcast.
yeah. You were on it, and so that's
I
amazing.
was.
So, but it's called the Story Blender, and I interview some of the leading storytellers, writers, and filmmakers in the world. And so it's a weekly podcast. It's free. You can just search for the Story Blender wherever you listen to them, or storyblender.com has more information. But it's
Awesome.
been fun. I've interviewed about 200 of some of the best, known writers in the world, and I always just ask them, what are the secrets to a great story? And so it's been super
Neat.
fun to
Yeah.
do that, pick their
It's a
brains.
it's a good podcast, so I encourage everybody to listen to it because I enjoy listening to that, and there's a lot of archived episodes I have to get through yet, but this is good.
Yeah, there are a few.
Well, thank you so much for coming, and maybe we can have you on again to discuss more deep questions in the future.
Sounds good. We'll do it.